This is the second lecture on World War II. The focus of this lecture is on the start of the war and then how the war was conducted, both on the front lines and the home front. If you remember from the last lecture, in the fall of 1938 at the Munich Conference, Great Britain and France had agreed to Germany's demand for a portion of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. They did this in the hope that this would be the end of German expansion. They were wrong. In spring of 1939, the German military moved in to occupy all of Czechoslovakia. England and France now realized that their appeasement policy had failed. They stepped forward to issue a statement that they would defend the territorial integrity of other European nations going forward. This was a warning to Germany not to move against another European country going forward. In particular, concerns centered on Poland, which the Western European leaders believed would be Hitler's next target. In the summer of 1939, Western Europe was greeted with a surprise. The Soviet Union and Germany entered into a non-aggression pact. This is an agreement by two historic enemies not to engage in any hostilities against one another. It was really a pragmatic decision on the part of Germany that would shore up its eastern border, allowing it to concentrate on Western Europe and the war that was inevitably coming. On September 1st, 1939, ignoring the warnings of the rest of Europe, Germany invaded Poland. In response, good to their word, England and France declared war on Germany. In the spring of 1940, the Germans initiated a lightning attack across Western Europe that resulted in their gaining control of most Western European territory to the English Channel. You'll see on the next slide exactly the extent of the spring 1940 offensive. By the summer of 1940, of the original powers that stood against Germany, only England remained. Between August and December of 1940, England would endure daily aerial bombing attacks known as the Battle of Britain. This slide defines blitzkrieg assault for you and visually shows you the extent of Germany's reach across the European continent. This slide illustrates aspects of the Battle of Britain for you. The Battle of Britain was an air campaign waged by the German Air Force against the United Kingdom. The purpose of this was to destroy the production capacity in England and to weaken the spirit of the English people. This was, in all likelihood, in anticipation of a land invasion at some point in 1941. The image on the left, the map of the United Kingdom, gives you a sense of where the targets were in England and the intensity of those targets. So you can see that the purple represents the capital of England and the Manchester area, which was the chief factory area of England. But over time, the bombing spread out more widely across England, and it became less about production and more about trying to break spirit. The upper right is an illustration, a kind of geo-mapping of all of the places where a bomb hit the ground in a particular location. The lower right is simply a photograph of the devastation. For this period of time, August to December, it was common for there to be nightly bombings in London and other parts of the United Kingdom. Still, the United Kingdom withstood these air assaults, and the British Air Force, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, was heroic in its defense of the island kingdom. This slide simply reminds you that as war broke out in Europe, Japan had free rein to occupy the European colonial possessions in Southeast Asia. Since this map represents 1942, you will also notice that Japanese possessions include the Philippine Islands, because by that time, the United States and Japan were at war. Back in the U.S., FDR was not sitting idly by. Based on information he'd received that the Germans were pursuing an atomic bomb, FDR authorized the Manhattan Project, a U.S.-based effort with a similar objective. In 1940, in October, a full month before the election that would determine whether or not FDR would get his third term, he asked Congress to reinstate the draft as a wartime preparedness measure. He went on to win his third term rather handily the following month. He got 55% of the popular vote, and he had 449 electoral votes to his opponent's 82. Following that election, he was more open about the U.S. committing to aid Great Britain in her effort to withstand German aggression. He replaced the cash and carry programs of the pre-war era with Lend-Lease and escorting. Lend-Lease recognized that Great Britain had no resources with which to pay for supplies at this point, so the United States would lend or lease those supplies and equipment with the expectation of being paid at some time in the future. Escorting committed America to providing ships that would see to the safety of British ships carrying goods from the United States across the Atlantic back to Great Britain. Finally, in August of 1941, FDR and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met for 4 days in a ship off the coast of Newfoundland. The result of that meeting was the Atlantic Charter, which was a statement committing both powers together to ending Nazi tyranny. It also laid out a vision for post-war world that included open markets around the globe, self-determination for all colonial peoples, and a New Deal-style labor system, fair equity treatment for workers around the world. As FDR was meeting with Churchill in the North Atlantic, Hitler made the surprising decision to invade Russia and open a second Eastern Front in Europe. This obviously negated the non-aggression pact the two countries had entered into in 1939. Russia would enter the war on the Allied side. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked the American Navy at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The following day, President Roosevelt requested and got from Congress a declaration of war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, largely because of the loose alliance between Japan, Germany, and Italy. Just as the United States entered the war, it seemed that her enemies were at the peak of their power. The Allied side now included the United States, Great Britain, Soviet Union, remnants of the French military that had refused to surrender to the Germans in 1940, known as the Free French, and a portion of forces in China, the nationalist Chinese government, that internal government that was fighting with the communists prior to World War II. So it was not all of China, but a small portion of China. But 1942 also sees the beginning of the Allies' ability to inflict damage on their Axis adversaries. In the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, the United States is able to do significant damage to the Japanese Navy, halting the Japanese expansion in the Pacific and safeguarding Hawaii and Australia from invasion. Germany's assault on Russia comes up short at the siege of the city of Stalingrad, forcing the entire German Sixth Army, some 300,000 soldiers, to surrender to the Russians. A second front and its small invasion of Italy, launched in the summer of 1943, leads to Mussolini's fall from power. He is temporarily put back in power only because German troops come to his rescue. Germany will have to devote a significant level of resources to keep him in power going forward. The Allies are also able in 1942 and 43 to halt the western advance of Germans across North Africa in their effort to control the entire Mediterranean coastline. Finally, in 1944, on June 6, the Allies launched their coordinated invasion of Western Europe, D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. This slide just gives you a sense of the massive preparations that went into the D-Day landing. It also shows you the pace of movement into the interior following the initial landing on the beaches that day. I always find it absolutely fascinating that there was included in the preparations a deception trying to get the Germans to buy into the plan that the Allies were not going to cross at Normandy, but rather much further to the north at Calais. To some extent, the Germans did buy the deception, which enabled the landing to have slightly more of an advantage than it otherwise would have. Late 1944, the German military launched a last desperate counteroffensive against the Allies. It failed, leaving the way open for the Allied forces to move ever eastward, and in March 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River, entering Germany from the west. The Soviet troops would be pushing westward from the eastern side of Germany and would enter that country at about the same time. In April, the Allies took the capital city of Berlin. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in a bunker underneath the city, leaving the remnants of his military to accept an unconditional surrender on May 7th. That day is known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe, which signified the end of the war, but only in that theater. There was still the war in Asia. Spring battles were aimed at gaining control of islands that could serve as staging areas for bombers that could reach the Japanese islands proper. The plans being formulated were for an invasion of the Japanese islands. The Japanese had indicated they would defend every inch of their homeland. But before that could happen, on August 6th, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, and then on August 9th, a second bomb on the city of Nagasaki. By August 15th, the Japanese had accepted an unconditional surrender demand, and the war in Asia was over. This would be known as VJ Day. The war in both theaters had now ended. The entire domestic economy geared up to win the war. It had to. The government was willing to deficit spend in order to produce the number of war materials and food for the military that would be required. Given the length of this war in comparison to World War I, it was inevitable that shortages would appear on the civilian side. The government tried to handle those shortages by controlling prices, limiting what could be charged for an item, and by rationing, by issuing a rationing book with coupons indicating how much meat, sugar, chocolate, gasoline you could get in a month. And in the end, there were shortages of every type, and a lot of pent-up consumer demand would emerge at the end of the war. The Office of War Information's purpose was twofold. One, to keep up Americans' spirits, and two, to get them focused on contributing to the war effort. More than anything else, America needed manpower to win the war. 16 million Americans served in the military during World War II. That represented 11% of a total American population at the time of approximately 140 million. Most of the men who didn't serve in the military proper served in civilian roles in war production and in other essential occupations. Like with consumer goods, there were shortages of manpower throughout the war. Those shortages would be alleviated by the entrance of women into the workforce in large numbers. The labor shortage meant that women became indispensable to the war effort. For the first time ever, women could enroll in the military. They served in the Army as WACs, in the Navy as WAVES, and in the Coast Guard as SPARs. There were limitations on what they could do in the military, and there were other regulations that applied only to women and not men. For example, women had to be only between certain ages. If married, they must have no children, things like that. And the expectation in the legislation that enabled them to become members of the military was that they would go back into their homes after the war, so that while we enrolled women in the military to win the war, we would not have military women going forward. In addition, most of the women served their country in war production roles or in work outside the home that freed up men for war production roles. And here's where we see the numbers of women rising to almost 20 million women in the labor force. For the first time, married women were recruited into the labor force. And ultimately, from 1943 on, married women with small children were recruited into the labor force. This is the first time that we see a sustained effort to employ women with small children. It really is a huge culture shift for the country during the war. We see the changing views about women in work most clearly in the image of Rosie the Riveter, the factory woman who could produce an airplane because the war needed to be won. America isn't proud of everything that happened during World War II. Right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was concern and worry about a potential invasion on the West Coast. That manifested itself as an anti-Japanese hysteria, which was all out of proportion given that the Japanese population was only about 127,000. Of that number, some were indeed immigrants. Those were the Issei. But many of them were the children of immigrants, or Nisei, who were citizens of the United States in their own right. Nonetheless, the fear of conspiracy and potential invasion led the government to quarantine many of the Japanese from the coast to camps in the interior. That quarantine was challenged in the courts, and in the case Korematsu v. U.S. in 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the president's executive order mandating the quarantine, arguing that it wasn't racist, but that it was an emergency measure reasonable in time of war. Most of the interned were allowed home even before the war ended. And Americans were indeed embarrassed at the treatment of the Japanese during the war, so much so that in 1988, Congress authorized partial compensation to those individuals who had directly suffered because of the quarantine.